Good morning, good evening. Whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you might be doing, we welcome you into the Silverlight Show. The Silverlight shines to illuminate that which lies hidden in shadow. If you're listening on our affiliate, the Life Online radio station at www.lifebroadcastingcenter.com, we welcome you in. If you're listening on YouTube on the Silverlight channel, we welcome you in. A special thanks goes out to the sponsor of this episode, Affinity Writing and Editing Services. If you write anything, they can help. You can contact them on Twitter at AffinityWES. That's AffinityWES. Some people think manual human editing is crazy. It's a product of a bygone age. But in the modern age, humans still understand art better than machines. And that's perhaps one of the reasons that our inner madness has become manifest. Speaking of manifest madness, there was a full moon on Wednesday. People have always looked to the sky for portents and fortunes. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence from police officers, nurses, and other people who are involved in working with people that the full moon affects people. It makes them a little bit crazy. And that's one of the reasons, even though astrology is passé in the modern world, people still look to the sky to find out anything they can see, for anything that they can make out. And what they see cannot always be explained. Meteors and comets are relatively common, yet comets didn't really quite get explained until the late 1700s. And besides them, there's plenty of unidentified objects. Now, when you hear unidentified objects in the sky, most people immediately associate that with UFOs. Most people think immediately of Roswell in 1947, where supposedly the alien crash happened. But just before that, a man named Kenneth Arnold had a sighting. He saw some mysterious objects that were in the region of, in Washington state, that were little disks moving faster than his plane at the time. And he's actually the one who gave us the word flying saucers. Now, this announcement took place on June 24th, 1947, which was 2 weeks before the famous announcement of the Army base at Roswell. And it should be noted that Kenneth Arnold, when he said flying saucer, he was not describing the shape of the objects at all. As a matter of fact, he said that they were very small and difficult for him to see exactly what they were. He described how they moved, like saucers skipping on a lake, saucers skipping on water. Now, in the modern day, everybody has skipped a rock, and that's the motion he's referring to. They were kind of bobbing up and down as they moved along. But in popular culture, the flying saucer part stuck. And for a long time, even into the 1960s with Star Trek, the idea of a flying disc floating through the air was pretty much how most people pictured alien craft. Now, however they moved, Kenneth Arnold kind of gained an instant reputation for himself as being the guy who saw that crazy stuff. And very shortly afterwards, he was dispatched to investigate an incident at Maury Island that was also in Washington state, where he would meet a gentleman named Fred Chrisman. But the Maury Island story deserves its own episode as far as the insane stuff that happened there. The important thing is that UFOs, flying saucers, unidentified aerial phenomena, whatever you want to call them, have a long history. And as a matter of fact, date back to before 1947 when Roswell, Kenneth Arnold's sighting, and the Maury Island incident happened. Just a little over 40 years before that, there was a rash of strange objects in the sky that began to be noticed on November the 18th, 1896. That's right, 1896. Two newspapers independently reported on an odd apparition over Sacramento, California. Now, this was 24 years before Sacramento even became a city, was 27 years before they even had electrical services. So before there was even a standard utility, this mysterious thing showed up in the air. So as you can imagine, there wouldn't be a lot of light pollution. At night, you'd be able to see a lot in the sky. Now, the object was described as about 1,000 feet in the air. And initially, they couldn't see much more than a light. Now, remember, reporting on 1,000 feet in the air in 1897 is very difficult. These are not people that are used to planes, trains, automobiles, anything that we are used to in the modern world. So we're going to reserve our judgment on 1,000 feet thing. But since it's impossible to identify this, we can still note that he claims that he heard voices. Now, from 1,000 feet away, you can still hear voices, but they're relatively faint. Now, there's a gentleman named R.L. Lowry. He's important, although please note they only use his initials. As anybody who's read a Sherlock Holmes novel knows, or anything from that time period, they tend to focus on the last name rather than the given name. Now, Mr. Lowry reported that the craft was powered by two men on pedals. And apparently, they were singing. He could hear singing of some sort. And it's also reported that the nose was on the light of this airship. Now, it's important to remember that humanity was still in a pretty primitive state as far as technology goes. There were some starts to what we know today, but a powered aircraft like what we know was still 7 years in the future. The Wright brothers would not get their aircraft flying until 1903, and we're still in 1896. So an airship was the most advanced craft they could relate to. That was the only thing they knew that could fly in the air. But the first airship flew in 1852, which was 44 years before these incidents happened, in 1896. And even the most advanced technology in the world at that time, the airships would rarely travel more than 5 miles or 8 kilometers. And the people that worked on these airships were the NASA and SpaceX of their day. In the United States, there isn't very many records of people working on airships at this point. In Germany, you have the beginnings of blimps and zeppelins. The French were big working on it. And the United States focused more on powered flight, powered heavier than air flight. Not to say that there weren't airship inventors, but it wasn't such a big deal in the United States at the time. Now, by World War I, which is 20 years later than this, Zeppelins were finally capable of bombing London. But that was still 20 years of technology away. Think about where we've come in the past 20 years. 10 years ago, the space shuttles were retired. They served for 30 years. Before that, we're talking Apollo, Mercury, and the X-15. The technology keeps going down from there. Unfortunately, with propulsion technology, humankind is not doing an exponential rise, but doing a very mathematical, slow rise. And it was the same back in the 1800s when it was literally inventors tinkering in their backyards, tinkering in their garages, whatever they could do to pass the time. It was generally an activity that was conducted by wealthy people who, for lack of better, think Batman. These were the Batmans of their day. Now, so let's look back at this aircraft that we have. It's a light that is shining into this man's eyes, and he can barely make out two people pedaling, or what he thinks to be two men pedaling, because remember, he doesn't really have a concept of what this is. And he's hearing singing. Well, two men who are busy pushing and pedaling on bicycles rarely sing because they're breathing heavily. So, what would this possibly be? Chances are, given the technology of the day, it sounds more like a steam engine. Again, the light is in this man's face. He doesn't really know what he's looking at, so two men, two cylinders chugging away seems much more reasonable. And the singing would be the rotating of the engine, the cogs, etc., which would have a particular rhythm that he wouldn't be familiar with, but would sound something like somebody singing. But Lowry does mention a passenger compartment, which is logical. It would definitely be within his frame of reference because hot air balloons have been flying since 1783. And Sacramento, while not quite a city, was the gold rush capital of California. So they would have seen demonstrations of people with balloons, maybe even a primitive airship or two. But he would have known that the floating thing goes on top and the passengers go in the bottom. So it's reasonable to treat R.L. Lowry as a knowledgeable but inexperienced witness. He knows what an airship is, but lacks the vocabulary to describe what he is seeing. And of course, we're not quite sure what happened to this ship. But with two independent newspapers and eyewitnesses, we know that something was going on at that time. The next day, as a matter of fact, a couple hundred people managed to come forward and state that they had witnessed this same craft in the sky. After that, it seems to have gone away. Whether the experiment didn't go as planned, whether the inventor lost interest, whatever happened, that was it. This big airship that had gone over the skies of Sacramento, which was not a small city, there were hundreds of people there, was never heard from again. Now, there are other scattered observations throughout the United States and the southern area at this time, but these seem to be a bit sketchy, so I'm going to skip a little bit. As a matter of fact, about a year. Because the next interesting case shows up on April the 18th, 1897, in Waxahachie, Texas. My apologies to anybody in Texas if I happen to have mixed up the name. Now, Waxahachie was roughly in the Dallas area, for those of you who are looking for a familiar city. And there's a gentleman named Judge Love. Now, Judge was his actual given name. He wasn't an actual judge. So he was a very credible witness, but at the same token, not necessarily given that title because of his job. But he reported that the craft was 50 to 60 feet long, with propellers fore and aft, and with huge floodlights. Now, this contact is very interesting because Judge Love had a conversation with the people who were crewing the airship. Now, keep in mind, this is 1897, and people in the United States were still very polarized by appearances. The Civil War and slavery were only finished with in 1865, 32 years before. So Judge Love would have actually realized, these people look like me, they don't look like me, but he doesn't report that. He just reports them as being 5 regular men, not Mexicans, not black people, not Asians, nothing. He just considers them regular, ordinary, run-of-the-mill people. This is important because, again, 1897 Texas would not be a very pleasant place to be a minority. Now, according to Judge Love, who was not at all reluctant to mix with these strange people he had never met before, he claimed that these 5 people were from the North Pole, and they were descended from the lost tribes of Israel. Furthermore, they learned English in 1553 from Hugh Willoughby. 1553 is about 300 years before this. And there's a lot to unpack in the statement. It's enormous. Now, Judge Love may very well have heard of the Lost Tribes of Israel. I mean, 1897, Texas is a very Christian area, mostly Baptist, although there was a lot of evangelical groups that are down in that area at this time. So he might have read the Bible and seen the reference to the 10 lost tribes. He might have heard it from a preacher. This reference to me, I think, is very solid. The idea of the lost tribes had been something that had been stuck in Western psychology for millennia, just millennia. Now, those 10 tribes disappeared in 772 BCE. That's before the birth of Jesus and before the counting of the modern age. And that was because they were conquered by the Assyrian Empire. The only tribes we know of that are left today are Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, which form our modern-day Jewish community. But these 10 lost tribes, Reuben, Dan, I could go down the list, it's not really interesting, were completely lost. The Assyrians came in, wiped them out, and they're never heard from again, archaeologically, historically, or even mentioned in the Assyrians' records. Whatever they did, they were gone. So it's always been a big mystery where these 10 lost tribes go. Apparently, they were on board this airship. Now, the problem is that they say that they're from the North Pole, or more accurately, the islands beyond the northern horizon. Now, this is very problematic because, as I stated earlier, airships of the time could only go about 5 kilometers, 8 kilometers or so before having to refuel. It's a lot of energy to fly, even in a lighter than air aircraft. You have to keep the whole structure in the air, you have to keep it propelled going forward, and fuel economy was kind of a joke that they would tell in a bar to each other. There is no such thing. You burn the fuel you needed to take to a destination. So, how they would get from the North Pole to Dallas is very problematic. The North Pole at that time was located in northern Canada. So, even as giving them a head start, there's no real path that you can take jumping in ranges of 5 to 10 kilometers to go from the North Pole to Dallas. Even going from Detroit to Dallas would have been a very difficult feat at this time because, like I said, the airships were just too limited in their range. It's still 20 years away for them to develop enough fuel economy to go 100 miles, and at this point, we're talking before the development of interstate roadways, highways, gas stations, electricity, anything that they would have needed to cover that distance, which is quite unlike what the Germans had. They had fully developed infrastructure, they had coal, they had gasoline, they had everything they needed to make their airships work. So, we have the lost tribes of Israel, who are apparently incredibly technologically advanced. Now this, I would be willing to chalk this up and say, okay, this is a little bit fantastical, but there's a very important, though obscure, person that is mentioned here, Hugh Willoughby. Supposedly the person that the 10 lost tribes of Israel learned English from was a gentleman that hadn't been alive for 300 years. See, Hugh Willoughby is an important, though obscure figure in English history. He served in the court of Henry VIII. That's right, the king with 6 wives, and the founder of the Anglican Church. Now, the Anglican Church was King Henry's way to split away from the Catholic Church, which was done, of course, like everything was, for political reasons. He wanted to choose his own marriage, choose his own wife, do his own thing, and didn't want to be seeking the Catholic Pope's blessing every time. Now, the curious thing is that Texas has a large evangelical Protestant population. It's called the Bible Belt for a reason. And Baptists were considered Puritans. Puritans were the ones who broke away from the Anglican Church, claiming they hadn't gone far enough to reform. Not only ignoring the Pope, not only ignoring all the old dogma, they went so far as to establish new hardcore rules. And this is where a lot of the United States mentality comes from, because they were founded by the people who left Britain, who left the king who said the Catholic Church is wrong because they said, you have not gone far enough. We are the ones who will take care of it and do it right. Now, going back to Hugh Willoughby, he was an explorer. He first gained his knighthood at King Henry's hand while they were campaigning in Scotland. So this was a warrior, this was a gentleman who was well known in his own time, but like a lot of famous generals in the past, he's simply not important enough to be remembered by history. And as a matter of fact, in July 30th, 1554, he led an expedition. Now, these were 3 brand new vessels that were constructed specifically for him. And they were looking for a northeast passage over Asia. This is in contrast to most of the explorers, like Martin Frobisher and a lot of others, who were looking for a northwest passage, away above the Americas. For some reason, Hugh Willoughby decided to go the opposite way. Now, his expedition did turn out to be a success. One of his ships made it through, and they actually established the Muscovy Trading Company. They made it to the court of Ivan the Terrible. Again, this is the time period we're talking. Henry VIII, Ivan the Terrible. But Hugh Willoughby himself disappeared in 1554 on July 30th, because his 2 ships were beset by high winds and terrible storms. At this point, Europe, and indeed the world, were locked into what was called the Little Ice Age. The Thames River in London used to freeze regularly, and that period of history covers from 1303 to 1850. This is why the Baltic Sea has always been known as very treacherous. There's virtually nothing that is ice-free in that entire region. So Hugh Willoughby was one of the brave souls who tried, and ultimately he failed, to find his way east, to find his way to the Spice Islands, to the legendary Islands of Gold, to what everybody was searching for in the west at the time. Now, Hugh Willoughby was found the next spring by some Russian fishermen. So he died that winter, whether from frostbite, whether from lack of food, lack of provisions. The cold can kill you in all sorts of ways. So whatever happened to him, whatever regrettable tragedy befell him, in 1897, we have these people claiming to be the lost tribes of Israel who learned English from a lost expedition and reporting this to Judge Love in Texas, 3,000 years after the first incident and 300 years after the second. So no matter whether this is a hoax or real, someone had really, really extremely good knowledge of history. Now this incident is worthy of our attention because it takes place on April the 18th, 1897. One day later, at April 19th, 1897, a mere 67 miles away, just the other side of Dallas, is a little town called Aurora, Texas. And I know I pronounced that one right. And this is an even more mysterious situation. You see, once again, there is what is described as an airship, and this is described in the Dallas Morning News. And supposedly this airship crashed into the property of Judge Proctor. Now, unlike Judge Law, this is an actual judge. Now, the airship is described as one that it was sailed throughout the country. But unlike the 5 pilots of the Waxahachie airship that were discussing their itinerary with Judge Law, This craft only had one person on board, or should I rather say, one being. Because in a significant contrast to Judge Love, the witnesses described this pilot as disfigured, but enough of its remains were there so they could tell it was not human. Again, we're talking 1897. These people knew what was human and what was not. They could name off Mexicans, black people, Asians, First Nations, you name it, they knew all that. They had seen disfiguration before. I mean, there were some pretty horrific accidents in 1897. Oh, falling off a horse could literally pull your leg clean off. Fire was a common occurrence. These people had seen pretty vicious stuff. But they still described this person as otherworldly. This was not just a victim of the airship crash, which would have been a logical thing for any of them to say, but it was someone so deformed, so different, they were from another world. Now, despite earlier descriptions of the 5-person airship being 50 feet long, this one doesn't seem to have taken very much space, because the sensibilities of the time said that this creature, whatever it was, deserved a Christian burial. Again, something very logical for people of Texas in 1897 to think. This man, foreign land, needs to be returned to the ground, returned to God where he belongs. So they had a little funeral, but the peculiar detail is they put the remains of his airship into the ground in his burial and in Judge Proctor's well. That is very unusual because a 50-foot airship, like what was described on the day before, still has a lot of material. You have all the fabric to take care of, which admittedly does deflate to a very small scale, and it would have to have some sort of crew compartment. In this case, you could fill a grave with it and then chuck the rest down the well. It doesn't even sound like it took a day for them to clean this stuff up. And indeed, there is a historical landmark at that place today in the very cemetery where the alien was buried, but the headstone for the alien is now missing. In the 1970s, a few news agencies took notice of this old article, and they went down, and MUFON, that's the Mutual Organization for UFO Investigation, they actually found the gravestone. And they ran some ground detecting, some metal detectors and stuff like that on it, and they actually found that there was something buried underneath there. They couldn't tell what it was. They applied to have permission to exhume the body, but it was denied to them. After all, graves are considered a sacred object. Whether we like it or not, graves are protected, both in our heart canon and according to the religious law. And really, who wants to dig up a grave, except when it's for something this significant? Now, over the years, this headstone has gone missing. Between the 1970s and today, 2020, it's gone. It's simply no longer there. So this means, over the years, quite likely in the 80s or 90s, someone has vandalized this grave. It's a desecration of the dead, and just a serious crime no matter what. Especially after the investigators were denied permission to dig up or search these ruins in any way, shape, or form. And somebody still came along and ripped everything to shreds. Now, these are only a couple sightings that are in the United States. And if they had only remained in the United States, it would seem pretty likely that they might be anomalous. Despite the number of sightings, they're all pretty clustered together. However, the unusual thing is nobody came forward to brag about this. Normally, inventors of this time were flamboyant. I mean, Thomas Edison is renowned for showing off his experiments. Nikola Tesla love to host demonstrations. But whoever it was that supposedly built these airships didn't take credit for them. That's not a very North American thing to do. It would be quite an accomplishment for them to say, hey, look what I've got. It's better than anything overseas. And it isn't confined to the United States alone. In 1909, which is barely 10 years later, a police constable who's named Kettle saw a strange cigar-shaped craft pass over Peterborough, Cambridgeshire. Now, this is an officer of the law who would be very unlikely to lie about this. And, in fact, his story was corroborated by a Mr. Banyard and a Mrs. Day. There's a dozen more sightings of this strange airship, or as the British termed it, a scare ship, between April and May. And most of them came in East Anglia and South Wales. Now, at first this seems less remarkable since airships and zeppelins were fast developing all throughout Europe. And once again, Germany led the way, and within 6 years their airships would be bombing London and southeast England. The only problem is that in 1909, these airships are being sighted on the western part of the English Isles, whereas London and all the other places that the airships would bomb in 1915 were on the eastern half. So we're talking an entire country away from technology that wouldn't even be developed for another 7 years. So the origin of the scare ships is questionable. Definitely doesn't seem to be Germans flying reconnaissance, since they didn't have the range to go there and they had the most advanced airships of the time. And once again, no one has come forward to take responsibility for what would be quite an achievement. So after this, airships kind of disappear from the common parlance. You get more modern appearances of aircraft. And people get used to seeing biplanes, whatever it is, heavier than aircraft going through the air. So airships become not as big of a priority. That doesn't mean that the strangeness goes away. In February 1942, Los Angeles shot 1,400 shells and a whole bunch of 50 caliber anti-aircraft fire into the air just because they thought they saw something. Now, this is a tension of World War II at work, but you also have to realize military discipline is at work. An artillery officer, especially an anti-aircraft officer, around a major metropolis like Los Angeles, is not going to give the order to fire unless he's sure what he's firing upon should not be there. So multiple military officers in charge of multiple batteries, of multiple guns, all letting go at the same moment means they saw something. Now, there have been reports that say that there was some sort of a meteorological balloon that was sent aloft at 1 o'clock in the morning. But 2.5 hours later, an hour worth of artillery fire goes off into the air. Military officers, as much as we like to make fun of them, are very disciplined people. They are trained not to waste ordnance, especially over a civilian population. Now, tense times were happening, but still, every bullet you fire, you have to account for. And all these officers would have had to have accounted for every single round that they expended. And just 5 years before Kenneth Arnold, the Roswell incident, and Maury Island, these mysterious things called Foo Fighters began buzzing planes of both Axis and Allied flight crews, both over Europe and over the Pacific. The first official report was on November 27, 1944, by the 415th Night Fighter Squadron. According to them, while they were executing their duties, a red ball followed them everywhere. Now, these are night fighter pilots. These are very experienced men, possibly the best that they have to offer, and they're trying to maneuver to get away from these balls, and every single step they take, these things are following them. Sworn statements are issued to information officers. Information officers are there to gather intelligence about the enemy. And these reports are not only written, they're sworn to, signed, and affidavits made of them. Now, these things appeared from England all the way out to the Pacific Theater and all the way out to the end of the Second World War. Now, despite all this, the Foo Fighters were written off as illusions, imagination, whatever. The Phantom airships and the scare ships have been forgotten to history. They are written off as mass delusion, as people trying some yellow journalism, but this discounts the fact that there's hundreds of witnesses, eyewitness accounts, policemen and judges who swore that what they saw was real, and most importantly, multiple newspaper accounts. One newspaper might publish a little bit of yellow journalism to get their figures up. Such things still happen to this day. I'm thinking of a few false news stories, but we're not going to name any names because I don't need to get into trouble like that. But the fact that multiple papers, multiple sources, and really high-ranking officials for the day would swear to this, shows that there's perhaps something here to be believed. We must remember that the past is a different country than what we have in the present. And anomalous reports like this, they were dismissed because such things were ridiculous and poppycock in polite society. Back then, the human race as a whole was convinced they knew the laws of physics. There were some things that were not established. Forgive that, that's my alarm. There were some things that had not been established, but at the same token, they were pretty sure they knew the order of the day. They knew that thanks to the fact that they had engines going all the way from steam engines up to the latest jet engines, anything else was simply absurd. And this is also kind of the attitude that we have in the present. The present, we kind of dismiss anything that's out of the ordinary. And this is not something that we should do. We should record everything. Once again, we make fun of military officers, but as an intelligence officer will tell you, a police officer will tell you, a detective officer will tell you, any detail, no matter how minor, is worth reporting. And this is where we come back to the importance that we all have today. We need to develop a complete picture, which is something that we're still struggling to do in the year 2020. So keep your eyes off your phone. Yeah, check your email, check things, but when you're outside, keep your eyes and ears open. And remember, we can't explain absolutely everything. Even today, our model of technology is not complete. Our physics are not complete. And every detail that we can fill in, every little thing that we can explain, the little things we don't notice, might be important for the future. And keeping our eyes and ears open and keeping records through blogs, through Facebook posts, Twitter, social media, whatever it is, you might get a little titter, a few people that are not quite ready to understand you, but at least if that information is recorded, someone in the future can look it up and try to put the pieces together. Now, we always need all information, and that's one of the reasons that I suggest we crowdsource getting that information. If everybody does a little bit, we'll have all the details we need to put the figures together. Now, until next week, thank you for joining us. You can contact us at silverlightservices@gmail.com. We welcome all feedback. Once again, thank you for joining us. Good day and good night, and keep your eyes up and open and your heart and mind clear.